Let's jump right in, shall we? Welcome to This Explainer, where we take these massive, complex, global systems and break them down so you can actually understand how our world runs. Today, we're looking at something absolutely massive. What happens when the world's most critical maritime choke points literally just shut down? We're zeroing in on the recent disruptions in the Red Sea and the Suez Canal. It is a fascinating, honestly kind of scary look at the fragile arteries of global trade and how a blockage in one random corner of the map can completely upend the shelves at your local grocery store. So, to really wrap our heads around the gravity of this, we've got to start with one big question. What actually happens when 12% of all global trade suddenly hits a brick wall? You see, the Suez Canal isn't just some convenient little shortcut for ships. It is a foundational pillar of the global economy. It's the main bridge connecting Asian manufacturing to Western consumers. When tensions force ships to stop going that way, we aren't just talking about a minor delay. No, we are talking about a massive, systemic shock to the entire global economy. And the staggering price tag for that shock? Try $10.7 billion. That's right. Research from the Oxford Program for Sustainable Infrastructure Systems puts the direct economic losses from these kinds of global maritime choke point disruptions at roughly $10.7 billion every single year. And remember, that's just the direct loss. We're talking cargo delays, the massive costs of rerouting, trade diversion, the whole shebang. It's an absolute financial blow. And countries that are heavily dependent on this route, places like Egypt, Yemen, Iraq, and Panama, they end up taking the hardest immediate hits. UNCTAD data really paints the picture here of that immediate shock. Heading into 2024, we saw a precipitous 75% collapse in Suez container volumes. 75%. As security risks escalated, major shipping lines basically looked at the situation and realized they had absolutely no choice but to completely abandon the route. Within just a few weeks, this incredibly busy maritime highway, one that usually handles billions of dollars of goods, effectively turned into a ghost town for commercial container ships. To put that into perspective for your everyday life, just think about this. 30% of all global container traffic normally relies on this single waterway. That is almost a third of the world's sneakers, laptops, medical supplies, and auto parts, all funneling through one narrow canal. When that flow just stops, it's not just a logistics headache for some shipping company, it immediately becomes a massive inventory crisis for practically every major retailer and manufacturer on the planet. Which leads us right into Section 1, the Great African Detour, bypassing the Suez Canal entirely. The sheer reality of this detour is mind-boggling. By bypassing the Suez and sailing all the way down and around the Cape of Good Hope, you are adding up to 14 days to a typical trip between East Asia and Northern Europe. That tacks on over 3,000 extra nautical miles and burns an extra 2,568 tons of heavy bunker fuel per single voyage. It's kind of crazy when you think about it. We live in an era of next-day delivery algorithms, right? And yet we're suddenly forcing 21st century supply chains to rely on 19th century maritime detours. You simply can't just slap an extra 2 weeks onto a global supply network and expect it to hum along normally. Cash gets tied up in inventory that's just floating on the ocean, and companies have to drastically bump up their safety stock just to keep their shelves from going bare. And all of that extra time at sea triggers a massive operational shift. This longer journey artificially absorbs about 5 to 7% of all global container capacity. Let that sink in for a second. Because these massive ships are spending an extra 2 weeks on the water, they aren't getting back to port to pick up the next load. It's effectively yanking up to 1.8 million TEUs, that's standard shipping containers, straight out of the market. This creates this bizarre artificial shortage of ships globally, which tightens capacity even on trade routes that have absolutely nothing to do with the Red Sea, like the route from Asia to the US West Coast. Now let's dive into Section 2, global supply chain dominoes, and those massive ripple effects. The immediate financial toll of that sudden capacity crunch, it is brutal. Spot freight rates on key routes just absolutely skyrocketed. Take the route from Shanghai to Rotterdam, for example. The cost to ship a container there spiked by a mind-blowing 158%. Look, when shipping companies are forced to burn way more fuel, pay for extra weeks of transit time, and scramble to find any available ships, they aren't eating those costs. Those expenses get passed straight down the line. And ultimately, that pressure lands right on us, the consumers, driving up the price of goods and feeding right into global inflation. But wait, it goes so much further than just the cost of shipping a box. This triggers some serious secondary dominoes. First, you get what the industry calls burst port congestion. Ports are finely tuned machines running on super tight schedules. When a bunch of delayed ships finally do show up, they tend to arrive all at once, a messy phenomenon known as clumping. This completely overwhelms the ports, causing these epic traffic jams. On top of that, insurance premiums for ships that actually dare to enter high-risk zones, those spiked by up to 250%. But maybe the most critical fallout was the severe localized food inflation. Gulf states that rely heavily on imported calories suddenly had to airlift staple foods at a premium, which generated domestic food price inflation of up to 120%, just unimaginable. That brings us to Section 3, the hidden environmental cost and the real climate impact of all this. Burning thousands of extra tons of fuel per ship doesn't just hit the wallet, it has a truly devastating climate impact. Rerouting all these ships around the Cape of Good Hope has generated roughly 61.6 million excess metric tons of CO2. Because the journey is so much longer and demands so much more of that incredibly heavy fuel, we're actually seeing a 41.8% increase in emissions per single voyage. At a time when the maritime industry is under so much pressure to finally clean up its act and decarbonize, this forced geographical detour is a massive, incredibly frustrating step backward for sustainability. Finally, let's look at Section 4, hunting for alternative corridors to bypass these choke points. Knowing how vulnerable we are, the world is now desperately trying to build in some redundancy. We are basically witnessing a real-time redrawing of the global supply chain map. Beyond the standard Suez route, nations are throwing money at finding workarounds. You've got the Northern Sea Route up in the freezing Arctic, the IMAC corridor stretching right across the Middle East, and even huge proposed projects like the Canal in Thailand. The big, overarching goal here is simple: never ever be this reliant on a single geographic choke point again. Let's zoom in on one of the buzziest alternatives right now, IMEC. That stands for the India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor, and it's a really fascinating proposed multimodal network. The basic idea is you ship goods from India to the UAE, load them onto a train across Saudi Arabia to the Mediterranean, and then put them back on a ship to Europe. It could bypass the Suez Canal entirely and slash transit times by roughly 40%. But there's a catch. Actually, scratch that, there's a huge hurdle: intermodal handling costs. Every single time you move a heavy container from a ship to a train and then back to a ship, well, it adds friction, customs fees, and serious handling charges. So yes, it's fast, but it is certainly not cheap. Then you have the Arctic option. The Northern Sea Route, which hugs the icy coast of Russia, offers a 36 to 40% shorter distance between Asia and Europe compared to the Suez. That sounds great on paper, right? But that shorter distance is heavily weighed down by reality. First, you have to pay absolutely exorbitant icebreaker tolls. We're talking sometimes up to $800,000 just for one transit. Plus, you are constantly dealing with extreme, wildly unpredictable weather risks, not to mention a very short window when the route is even operational. It is definitely an alternative, but man, it carries immense operational hazards. So what does this all mean for the future? How do we actually fix this mess? Well, building true resilience requires a multi-layered strategy. First off, we've got to institutionalize these overland corridors. That means governments actually sitting down and working together to standardize customs and transit insurance so routes like IMAC become financially viable. Second, we need to develop alternative Middle East port nodes, maybe linking places like Oman directly to the Mediterranean by land. And finally, we have to digitize our ports. By deploying predictive AI logistics, ports could actually anticipate and absorb those crazy burst surges of ships when schedules inevitably fall apart. As global trade literally redraws its map right before our eyes, it leaves us with one seriously provocative question about the fragile nature of our interconnected world. Are we actually witnessing the end of the ultimate shortcut? Look, the Suez Canal isn't going anywhere, but this crisis has proven, without a doubt, that relying on a single, vulnerable thread to hold the entire global economy together is a risk the world can no longer afford to take. The hunt for resilience is officially on. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking those big questions, and I'll catch you next time as we dive into another fascinating topic.